When Daniel Cross plunged from the 44th floor terrace, he was clutching a scalpel in his left hand. The man who pushed him was Vincent Ashford, the protégé he had trained for 10 years, the cardiac surgery prodigy he had personally raised from a surgical intern, the man at whose daughter's wedding he had choked up during the toast and said, "You are the finest work of my life." In the instant of the fall, Daniel saw Vincent adjust the collar of his white coat with a gloved right hand, his movements as composed as if he had just stepped away from an operating table. Those eyes watched him accelerate away under a moonlight as cold and white as surgical lamps, carrying no rage, no murderous intent, only a precisely calculated relief, as if he had just excised a necrotic organ. Wind rammed into Daniel's ears, his nostrils, his lungs contracting violently in the freefall. 44 stories. The freefall would take less than 5 seconds. Inside those 5 seconds, his brain, racing with the hyperacuity of near death, did not flash with terror. Instead it served up image after image. Vincent's clumsy fingers the first time he sutured a vessel, Vincent's blood-spattered gloves after completing his first solo bental procedure, the necktie Vincent had given him on his 60th birthday, printed with an almost invisible EKG waveform. Then this morning, sitting at his computer signing that encrypted file, Vincent standing behind him asking what he was doing. He had said, "Archiving some old data." Vincent had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You've worked hard, sir. Let's have a drink on the terrace tonight." He remembered thinking at that moment, the kid has finally grown up. Daniel's back punched through the awning at the 30th floor, smashed through an air conditioning unit at the 20th, and finally landed on a ventilation duct on the rooftop of the podium. His 9th thoracic vertebra burst fractured, 8 ribs snapped simultaneously, the broken ends spearing into the lower lobe of his right lung. His spleen ruptured, intra-abdominal hemorrhage exceeding 3,000 milliliters. His left kidney impaled by bone shards. But he did not die. The canvas awning absorbed the first impact, the sheet metal of the AC unit absorbed the second kinetic blast, and the curved surface of the ventilation duct caught his shattered body. He would never know these physics details himself. All he knew before consciousness winked out was that his left hand still gripped that scalpel. The blade had snapped during the fall, leaving only a half-length shard, its edge still wickedly sharp. Engraved on the handle, Daniel Cross, cardiac surgery. A gift from his doctoral advisor, German-made, forged tungsten steel, used for 20 years. What Vincent Ashford did not know was that Daniel, in the second before he was pushed, had already drawn that blade across the back of Vincent's sterile glove. Very shallow, just enough to breach the glove and lacerate the dermis. The cellular residue left on the blade would be ironclad evidence at any forensic examination, if Daniel's body were ever found. But even more crucially, Vincent did not know that Daniel had, that very morning, signed an encrypted document uploading the entire core dataset of Edge Return, the world's first nanobot-targeted myocardial regeneration therapy, to an offshore cold storage node registered under an alias. The document had a 72-hour deadman switch. If Daniel did not manually cancel it, the files would automatically send to the International Society for Heart Surgery, the WHO Medical Ethics Committee, and the editorial boards of 3 top-tier global medical journals. What Vincent had obtained was a mirrored file with the core parameters swapped. The alterations were exquisitely subtle, appearing identical to the originals, with fatal flaws that would only reveal themselves in actual clinical application. Daniel's hand had been steady when he did it, but his heart had been cold. He hadn't known whom he was guarding against, had only acted on a raw survival instinct to back everything up. Now he knew. He lay on that deformed ventilation duct, staring at the sky sliced into a narrow ribbon by the high-rises. He could feel his blood pressure dropping rapidly, the darkness at the edges of his vision contracting toward the center. He heard applause and laughter drifting from inside the building. The entire cardiac surgery department was celebrating Vincent Ashford's nomination for the Society of Thoracic Surgeons Distinguished Contribution Award. The nomination stated, "Pioneered the theory of nanobot-targeted myocardial regeneration on a global scale, ushering in a new era of minimally invasive cardiac surgery." The nomination dossier was one Daniel himself had helped Vincent polish. He had revised it 3 times word by word down to the punctuation. Daniel closed his eyes and thought it was truly over this time. A doctor pushed off a 44th floor terrace, fallen onto a ventilation duct where no one would find him, clutching a broken scalpel, quietly dying. It sounded like a clumsy metaphor. Over a lifetime he had performed more than 3,000 heart surgeries, saved countless lives, and in the end he could not save himself. As he lost consciousness, the last thought drifting through his mind was not hatred but an icily calm medical assessment. Burst fracture thoracic vertebra with multiple organ trauma. Without effective intervention within 30 minutes, mortality was 100%. He wasn't fearing death. He was calculating his own mortality odds. Probably the final occupational tick of a cardiac surgeon. He did not die. At 3 a.m, a maintenance worker tasked with inspecting the ventilation systems found Daniel. The man was never supposed to be there. He had argued with his wife that day, couldn't sleep, and had come in early for his shift. When his flashlight beam hit Daniel, he nearly jumped out of his skin, then realized the blood-soaked man was still breathing and dialed 911. Daniel was rushed to the nearest hospital, where he was operated on for 13 hours, received 8,000 milliliters of blood, and underwent 2 laparotomies, 1 thoracotomy, and 1 spinal fixation. On his 4th day post-op, he woke in the ICU. The first thing his eyes landed on was a dead moth on the ceiling, dust caked on its wings, utterly motionless. He stared at that moth for a long time and then made a decision. Using a nurse's cell phone, he dialed a number. The number belonged to a man named Julian Crow, his classmate from medical school 30 years ago. Julian hadn't become a doctor. He'd gone into finance and later became the shadow operator behind an international hedge fund. The last call Daniel had made to him was the night Vincent Ashford won his first major federal research grant, when Daniel had gotten drunk and called his old friend to brag about his protégé. This time he was stone-cold sober. No small talk. He asked simply, "Can you make me disappear?" Julian's reply came as fast and decisive as a short on a failing stock. Under a false identity, Daniel was transferred to an unremarkable rehab hospital in Tacoma, where he lay for 11 months. After he could stand, he spent another 2 years in rehabilitation, relearning to walk like an infant. His thoracic spine now contained 8 titanium screws and 2 titanium rods. Every time he bent over, it was a negotiation with his own skeleton. During rehab, he began to write using his left hand. His right had suffered radial nerve damage during the fall. Much of it recovered, but the fine motor control was never the same, filling the blank backs of rehab hospital charts with dense symbols. Those symbols would later be organized into a complete myocardial regeneration protocol. But it wasn't based on stem cell transplants or gene editing. It was based on something he called the nanoblade array, a brand new delivery paradigm. Millions of pro-regenerative factor-carrying nanobots infused through the coronary arteries into the infarcted zone, guided by ultrasound to precisely anchor onto the surfaces of damaged cardiomyocytes, synchronously releasing regeneration signals to induce the infarcted heart muscle cells to re-enter the cell cycle and proliferate. This protocol circumvented all the existing dependencies on viral vectors and in vitro culturing in regenerative medicine, solving from its foundational logic the problem of targeted anchoring for nanobots in turbulent blood flow. It was called Edge Return 2.0. Its predecessor was called Edge Return. 11 years earlier, when Daniel had written the first version of the therapy in a cramped lab in Manhattan, Vincent Ashford was still a fresh med school graduate who couldn't even reliably locate the aortic sinotubular junction. Daniel himself had plucked his resume from a pile and spent 10 years personally teaching him every cardiac surgical procedure, from the simplest PDA ligation to the most complex total aortic arch replacement with elephant trunk stent graft. Vincent learned fast enough to make Daniel proud, and fast enough to make Daniel overlook the flicker that passed through Vincent's eyes after every successful surgery. It wasn't gratitude. It was hunger. A hungry man isn't grateful for being fed. He only thinks about how to get the keys to the kitchen. 11 years later, the man called Silas Stillman sat in his sharpening stall at Pike Place Market, using a Japanese natural waterstone to put a mirror polish on an old carbon steel chef's knife. The stall had been built 10 years ago. After rehab, he had first pushed a cart through the market, sharpening knives on the go, and saved enough to rent this wall space. The market manager was a short, heavy-set middle-aged woman everyone called Maggie. When Silas first came to lease the stall, Maggie had asked his name. He wrote Silas Stillman on the contract. Maggie said. That's a strange name. He smiled but didn't explain. Silas Stillman. Silas meant of the forest, still man, a man who was still here. The name didn't speak of noise, but it reminded him. He had not gone silent forever. He used this contradictory name to remind himself that one day he would speak. His sharpening stall, if you could call it a stall, was pitifully bare. One wall and a canvas awning. The wall was hung with sharpening stones of every grit, from 300 grit diamond to 30,000 grit natural water stones, arrayed like a geological timeline. On the ground sat 3 bench grinders, an ultrasonic cleaning bath, and several plastic buckets filled with different grades of honing fluid. A hand-lettered price sign stood at the front, the handwriting so precisely squared it looked measured with a ruler. Sharpening all blades. Knives $10, scissors $8, and no scalpels. He had written and crossed out those last 2 words, written and crossed out again 3 times over before he finally committed. He never wanted to touch a scalpel again, but he didn't want anyone asking why he wouldn't take scalpels. That price card was its own pathology. The market vendors called him Silas the Mute, because he didn't speak 5 words a day. From dawn to dusk he sat on that wooden stool stained gray by stone slurry, wearing a pair of old German magnifying loupes, both hands on the blade, pushing and pulling across the stone in a rhythm as steady as a Swiss machine tool. Chef's knives, scissors, leather knives, carving chisels, straight razors, he sharpened anything. When he finished, he would run the pad of his thumb ever so lightly along the edge, close his eyes to feel the sharpness, and then either continue or set it aside. The pad of his thumb was crisscrossed with tiny scars, layer upon layer of healed cuts from blades that had bitten back, rings like a tree's years. Each scar corresponded to an edge he had sharpened, and to a thought he had refused to forget. A surgery professor from the University of Washington Medical School happened to pass by, and watched him sharpen for half an hour. He went back and told his graduate students, "The knife sharpener at Pike Place, his hands are steadier than any attending surgeon in our hospital. Go watch his sharpening motion. That's what genuine, steady, precise, gentle looks like." One grad student actually went, bringing a protractor, pretending to wait in line to sharpen a knife while actually measuring the bevel angle of Silas's strokes. Back in the lab, he ran the data through a statistical analysis and reported to his professor. He takes 45 minutes on one chef's knife, both hands completely unsupported, and the edge angle deviation from start to finish does not exceed half a degree. I measured it. The professor was silent for a moment. Don't ask what he did before. Some people come here to disappear, not to be recognized. The student asked. Then why didn't he disappear somewhere else? The market is so crowded. The professor had no answer. He wanted to say that the most dangerous places are often the safest, but it sounded too much like a movie line and he was embarrassed to say it. In truth, he guessed wrong. Silas chose the market not because of the crowds, but because the sound of sharpening could drown out everything. The shouts of fishmongers, the cleavers hitting cutting boards, the crying of children, those noises could, for a little while, drown out the noise inside a grown man's skull. Silas never took small talk. He opened his stall at 6 every morning and closed at 7 at night, sharpening 20 to 30 blades a day, charging between $8 and $50 apiece. The money was just enough to rent a 300-square-foot studio near Lake Union and cover 3 meals of noodles a day. No one knew his past. No one noticed that every time he finished a blade, he jotted a string of strange symbols into a ledger. The symbols looked like anatomical diagrams but weren't, like drug molecular formulas but more complex. 11 years of ledgers filled more than 40 notebooks, each wrapped in waterproof craft paper, stored in a steel trunk under his bed, secured with 2 locks whose keys were sewn into 2 different work jackets. What those ledgers contained, if you pieced the symbols together and translated them into medical language, was a complete myocardial regeneration protocol ready for FDA submission. From nanobot surface modification processes to real-time feedback algorithms for ultrasound guidance, from animal model histopathology data to human pharmacokinetic models, every page was seamless. He had completed all of it in the gaps between sharpenings, 45 minutes sharpening a knife, 45 minutes solving a parameter optimization problem, another 45 minutes sharpening another knife, another 45 minutes solving a targeting anchor algorithm flaw. 11 years of sharpening sounds had burnished the protocol in his mind, over and over, grinding, polishing, deburring. until it reached a mirror finish. On a phone stand beside him, a beat-up phone with a cracked screen was live-streaming a Discovery Channel special. Silas didn't look up at the screen, but his ears were listening. In the picture, the National Conference Center at Lake Union blazed with light. Under the gold-letter banner of the 11th International Cardiac Surgery Innovation Forum, Vincent Ashford stood on stage in a sharply tailored dark blue suit. The name badge on his chest read, Vincent Ashford MD PhD FACC, Chief of Cardiac Surgery, Ashford Heart Institute. Behind him, a 60-foot-wide LED wall displayed exquisite 3D cardiac reconstructions and animations of nanobots repairing heart muscle. Those animations were intimately familiar. Every frame was something Daniel had personally created years ago. Vincent had merely swapped the color scheme from blue and white to gold and black and added the Ashford Heart Institute watermark. Vincent spoke in fluent, polished English. 12 years ago, when I first saw the electron micrograph of a nanobot successfully anchoring an infarcted myocardium in my laboratory, I knew the history of cardiac surgery was about to be rewritten. Traditional cardiac surgery can only repair structure, but edge return can regenerate function. This is the paradigm shift of surgery from repair to regeneration. Thunderous applause. He had deliberately moved the timeline back 1 year, because by that point Daniel Cross was already deceased, and no one could stand up to correct him. This detail had been carefully crafted. Even the tense of that line in his speech had been rehearsed dozens of times. In the front row center sat a young woman in an exquisitely tailored fog blue suit, a diamond-studded caduceus brooch pinned to her lapel. She was Vincent Ashford's wife, and also the executive deputy director of the Ashford Heart Institute. Her name was Julia Ashford, née Vance. She had been the college roommate of Daniel's daughter, Nell Cross. Yes, she was the roommate of the daughter of her husband's mentor. The relationship was so convoluted that gossip columnists needed several drafts of a relationship chart to straighten it out, but the truth was simple. Julia had met Vincent through Nell. During college, Nell brought her roommate home for a visit, and Vincent happened to be at Daniel's house reporting on a research grant. The first time Julia saw him, he was sitting in Daniel's study, adjusting data charts on his laptop. He looked up and smiled at her. She would later recall that smile with 4 words, warm as polished jade. What she didn't know was that the chart Vincent was adjusting that day was Daniel's original data. In the applause, Julia exchanged a glance with Vincent on stage, the corner of her mouth lifting in an arc only the two of them understood. The live-stream camera gave her a close-up. The host asked her, Mrs. Ashford, as co-founder of the Edge Return team, how do you respond to external questions about the origin of this technology? Julia's smile was elegant and poised. The logic of doubters is always the same: you're too young so you don't deserve it, you're too fast so you stole it. But medicine does not lie. Edge Return has passed dual certification from the FDA and the European Medicines Agency, and has completed over 20,000 clinical procedures in 47 countries. The 1-year post-op myocardial function recovery rate is 87%. That data is something no critic can refute. The host pressed. I understand your husband's mentor also worked in cardiac surgery and later met with an accident? Julia's smile dimmed, and a trace of perfectly measured reverence entered her voice. Yes, Professor Cross is a senior colleague we will always respect. He did make some early contributions to cardiac surgery, but later stepped away from the clinical front for personal reasons. Vincent has always said that the success of Edge Return is the best possible tribute to Professor Cross. As she said this, her eyes reddened faintly, as though genuinely mourning a departed mentor. She had practiced that expression at least 20 times in front of the bathroom mirror, making sure the degree of redness did not tip into melodrama or appear too faint to be noticed. She knew the camera would give her a close-up, just as she knew the script of every segment of today's event. Silas lifted the finished carbon steel chef's knife, holding it up to the fluorescent light to inspect the mirrored edge. In the blade's reflection, his own elongated face stared back. His fingers were steady, his breathing even. Only he knew that the titanium scaffold in his thoracic spine was subtly itching. Humidity was high in Seattle lately. 11 years on, every change in humidity reminded that scaffold to inform him he was still alive. He was alive and he could still walk. Embedded in his thoracic spine were 8 titanium screws and 2 rods, Every time he bent to sharpen, every time he leaned forward, it tested the limits of his skeleton. But he sat on that stool and bent over the stones every single day, because the forward-leaning posture was the only position that made his thoracic spine hurt less. Bending forward reduced the pressure inside the spinal canal, a physical pain management trick he had discovered on his own. He was managing pain with pain, offsetting one discomfort with another, like covering one lie with another. He had spent his whole life doing similar things. Masking contemplation with sharpening, masking rage with silence, masking presence with disappearance. The live stream continued. Vincent Ashford dropped the heavy news. Edge Return 2.0 had passed priority review by the FDA and was about to be rolled out nationwide. The Ashford Heart Institute's valuation had shattered the $200 billion mark in the latest funding round. Vincent's personal net worth exceeded $30 billion. When the news broke, Ashford Medical's stock on the Nasdaq skyrocketed 55%. People in the audience rose to their feet, clapping. More joined them. The applause surged like a tide from the front row to the back. Vincent stood on stage, nodding modestly, hands pressed together in thanks, his posture humble and polished. He was extraordinarily good at this. What he was best at was not performing surgery, not even doing research, but making others believe he was a genius. He had even convinced himself. Silas placed the polished chef's knife into the ultrasonic cleaner, let it vibrate for 3 minutes, fished it out, dried it with a chamois, applied food-grade anti-rust oil, and slid it into a craft paper sheath. He wrote a string of symbols into the ledger, numbered it, and placed it in the drawer. Then he removed his loops, stood up, and stretched his stiff thoracic spine. The titanium hardware emitted an almost inaudible creak, like someone tightening a screw in the distance. He pulled out his phone, an ancient candy bar model with the numbers nearly worn off the keypad, and dialed an encrypted number. A young man's brisk voice answered, laced with a Pacific Northwest inflection. Silas, I've pulled all of Ashford Medical's cold chain logistics data. The culture media they use for transporting the nanobots has a labeled shelf life of 36 months, but the actual stability data only runs to 18 months. The rest is linearly extrapolated, not empirically measured. Meaning, past 18 months, nobody really knows what happens to the anchoring efficiency of those nanobots in the bloodstream. The young man was Wyatt Cole, whom Silas had met 3 years ago. Back then, Wyatt was a computer science grad student at UW, grabbing clam chowder at Pike Place and casually bringing a chef's knife to be sharpened. While waiting, he sat on a plastic stool hammering out code. Silas glanced at his screen and saw he was writing a medical data scraper script. After the knife was done, Silas broke character and said a few extra sentences. A few sentences later, Wyatt had become his sole ally in Seattle, a knife sharpener and a hacker. The partnership worked surprisingly smoothly. Silas was quiet for a moment. It's enough. He began closing up, stacking the sharpening stones one by one and covering them with a dust cloth. His movements unhurried but every step precisely placed, like the closing sequence of a surgery. Notify Quinn. Launch the short. Also, leak that cold chain data anonymously to the FDA and the EMA. Use the darknet. Route through Switzerland. Wyatt said. Already on it. One more thing. Vincent Ashford is holding the national launch event for Edge Return 2.0 next week at the Meydenbauer Center in Bellevue. Huge production. They've invited state officials. Him choosing the Seattle area, do you think he's probing? Does he somehow sense you're here? Silas poured the last basin of honing fluid into the waste bucket and wiped down the work surface with a rag. Whether he's probing or not, this is my turf. 11 years of sharpening sounds. It's time he heard them. A week later at the Meydenbauer Center, overlooking Lake Washington, the floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows framed the blue expanse of the lake, gulls wheeling under the sky outside, their cries filtered by soundproof glass into a faint background hum. Today the hall was packed, hundreds of cardiac surgeons, hospital directors, pharmaceutical reps, and journalists gathered from across the country. Vincent Ashford had booked the entire main ballroom. The stage was designed as a giant anatomical model of a heart, left ventricle, right ventricle, coronary arteries, all outlined in LED strips pulsing with a simulated heartbeat. At the aortic root of that model was printed the Ashford Heart Institute logo, like a tattoo on the heart. Vincent wore a custom charcoal gray suit, a commemorative gold pen from his National Academy of Medicine induction, tucked into his left breast pocket. Standing before that massive LED heart, he began to speak in a voice polished to a high gloss. He traced a line from the Hippocratic Oath to the birth of modern cardiac surgery, from the first cardiopulmonary bypass operation to the application of nanotechnology in medicine, recounting how he had single-handedly carried the project forward after his mentor's untimely withdrawal. When his voice reached the emotional crescendo, it quavered slightly. 11 years ago, when Professor Cross left, he handed me all the materials for Edge Return. He said, "Vincent, I can't continue. You finished this for me." I have carried that sentence for 11 years. He had delivered that line dozens of times on various stages, and each time it hit the audience's tear ducts with sniper precision. This time was no exception. People in the audience began wiping their eyes. A few young female doctors openly teared up, passing tissues among themselves. In the third row sat an elderly professor, a former colleague of Daniel's, who shook his head but said nothing. Not that he didn't want to, he simply didn't dare. Vincent Ashford's academic and financial power had grown so vast that most potential critics chose silence. Just as Vincent reached for the remote to play the clinical data demo of Edge Return 2.0, every light in the ballroom died simultaneously. It wasn't a circuit breaker because the LED heart also went black, but the gulls outside were still flying, meaning it wasn't a citywide blackout. Just this ballroom. No emergency lights came on. Every electronic screen went dark. Some people screamed in the darkness. Others pulled out their phones and found those were black too. Wyatt's jamming program was surgically clean, precisely targeting the specific frequency bands of this ballroom. The blackout lasted about 20 seconds. 20 seconds enough to turn a carefully curated theater of lies into a simmering cauldron of anxiety. Then across the lake, the giant LED screen built into the slope of Cougar Mountain, an 800-yard-wide display normally used to flash Experience Washington tourism ads, blazed to life. The entire mountain screen turned pure white, and across that whiteness floated a single line of black text, set in the cold monospace font of a hospital chart, as if ripped directly from a patient monitor. "Vincent Ashford, do you remember that scalpel?" Vincent's hand froze in midair. The remote slipped from his fingers, bounced on the stage, and rolled into a seam of the LED heart model. The seam happened to be exactly at the aortic valve position. The remote lodged there, emitting a feeble red blink, like a malfunctioning surgical indicator. The mountain screen continued. 11 years ago, you pushed me off the terrace of Wing D, 44th floor of the Manhattan Cardiovascular Research Institute. You thought I died. I didn't. Today I've come to take back what you stole from me. Not revenge. It's debridement. You've let the world use a medical protocol with falsified core parameters for 11 years. Every patient who missed their optimal treatment window because of it, every patient who required a second thoracotomy because of nanobot anchoring failure, every patient who died from postoperative complications, they are all on your head. The ballroom erupted. Reporters raised their phones to photograph, only to find them still dead. The signal jammer blanketed the entire hall. Some rushed to the panoramic windows and pressed their phones against the glass, trying to capture the mountain screen, but the glass threw off the focus. Only the cold text on Cougar Mountain shone across the night waters of Lake Washington, each letter 3 stories tall, visible to anyone in the entire metro area who glanced west. Vincent spun toward backstage, snarling into the discreet lapel mic. "Kill that screen. This is medical defamation. Call the police. Get me the police." His voice fed through the mic to the control room, but no one answered. The control room was dark too. Wyatt had remotely locked out the control room's permissions long ago. Now every button in that room was as inert as stone. The mountain screen began to display the first document, the original patent filing archives from the U.S. Patent Office, scanned page by page. Inventor, Daniel Cross. Title, Method for Myocardial Regeneration Therapy, via Nanobot Coronary Artery Perfusion. Filing date, April 12, 11 years ago. 7 days later, Daniel Cross fell from the 44th floor. The timeline was blown up across the 800-yard screen, a wound pulled wide open. Then the second file. An internal email from Ashford Heart Institute, sender Vincent Ashford, recipient the Institute's clinical data manager, dated 3 days after Daniel's fall. The email body contained a single sentence. Migrate all pre-op assessment data and post-op follow-up records from all patients under Daniel Cross's name to my name. Seal the original charts. Overwrite the electronic records. Notify the clinical trials registry that the PI has been changed to me. Wyatt had excavated this email from Ashford Institute's backup servers, buried in an archived email folder of a former employee, encrypted but with the password set as Ashford123. Third file. An audio recording. Vincent Ashford's voice, background the beeping of an or heart monitor, clear as if recorded yesterday. Professor Cross, I have learned the last lesson you taught me. Cardiac surgery doesn't need 2 gods. One is enough. Please bow out quietly. I'll finish edge return under my name. By the way, that Bentel technique you taught me, I did 4 of them this week. All successful. Aren't you proud? The student you trained has finally surpassed you. Actually, I could surpass you a long time ago, but you were always standing in the way. As long as you stayed, I could never come into my own. Daniel had recorded this himself. That night on the terrace when he confronted Vincent, his phone had been in his pocket with the voice recorder running. The phone shattered in the fall, but Julian Crow had recovered the data from the memory chip through technical means. When Daniel first heard this recording, he was silent for a very long time, not out of anger, but because he noticed the tone Vincent used when mentioning the Bentel procedure. It wasn't triumph. It was resentment. Resentment toward the man he had once idolized. Down in the audience, a senior cardiac surgeon abruptly stood, his finger trembling as he pointed at the stage. He was Dr. Harold Pembroke, the elder statesman of American cardiac surgery, mentor to both Daniel and Vincent. He had been sitting in the audience the whole time, listening to Vincent's sentimental tribute, and had even clapped along. Now, hearing this recording, his entire body went rigid as if electrocuted. He opened his mouth to speak, but a searing pain clamped down on his chest. His assistant rushed to support him and fumbled for nitroglycerin. Pembroke shoved the pills away and with every ounce of strength, spat out a single word. Monster. His voice wasn't loud, but in the deathly silent hall it carried far. The mountain screen played the 4th file, a high-definition surveillance video. 11 years ago, the rooftop terrace of Wing D of the Manhattan Cardiovascular Research Institute, late at night. Daniel stood by the railing, scalpel in hand, in heated argument with Vincent. Their body language was violent. Daniel's blade tip pointed at Vincent's chest, his words rapid-fire. Then Daniel turned to grab his phone from the railing. In the instant his back was turned, Vincent pulled a pair of gloves from his pocket, surgical gloves, sterile, the kind specific to the OR, yanked them on with practice speed, stepped forward and shoved with both hands. Daniel crashed through the railing and vanished into the night. The video had no sound, but the motion of Vincent putting on gloves before the push was blown up in high magnification across the 800-yard mountain screen. That was a surgeon's muscle memory. Before any action that could leave biological trace evidence, first put on gloves. At the moment of committing murder, he was still observing sterile protocol. That detail was more chilling than any sound. In the audience, a veteran or nurse from Manhattan CV let out a strangled cry. Those are our or sterile gloves. I recognize the lot number. Vincent Ashford stood on stage, every drop of color drained from his face. His mouth opened, but all that came out was a choked gurgle, like air entering a heart-lung machine. Julia Ashford sat in the front row. She was wearing a burgundy suit specially chosen this morning. She was supposed to go on stage to present her husband with flowers, and she had picked the most photogenic color. Now that bouquet lay on her lap, its petals trembling. Not because the flowers were shaking, but because her legs were. She wasn't looking at the mountain screen or at Vincent or at anyone. She just stared down at the bouquet. A cluster of white lilies, the flower of purity. A red ribbon was tied around the stems, printed with gold letters. Ashford Heart Institute Edge Return 2.0 Launch Commemoration. She remembered the staffer who handed her the bouquet this morning asking if she wanted the flower meaning printed on the ribbon. She had said no, everyone knows what lilies mean. Now she felt that staffer was probably laughing behind her back. Lilies for purity, and she was holding this pure bouquet, while sitting at the feet of a man who had fooled the world with stolen technology for 11 years. The mountain screen did not pause. After the video, it switched to a clinical data comparison table. The left column was the edge return clinical data Vincent had published in the New England Journal of Medicine. 1 year post-op myocardial function recovery, 87%. The right column was the raw follow-up data recovered from Ashford Heart Institute's internal servers. Actual 1 year myocardial function recovery, 51%. 51%. Only 8 percentage points above the 43% of the placebo group. The other 36% in the published data had been falsified during the data migration. The electronic records overwrite from Vincent's email, overwriting these very numbers. Overwritten were 36 percentage points of efficacy, and more critically, the real clinical trajectories of hundreds of patients. Even more damning, a footnote appeared below the table, extracted from the original design document for Edge Return's core technology, signed by Daniel Cross. It read, "The targeted anchoring of nanobots in a turbulent blood flow environment is strictly limited by cardiac output and aortic valve peak flow velocity. In patients with a cardiac output exceeding 4.5 liters per minute or an aortic valve peak velocity above 2 meters per second, the anchoring efficiency will drop exponentially." In other words, Edge Return was effective for early-stage MI patients with relatively preserved cardiac function, but for severe patients with end-stage heart failure, the ones who most desperately needed myocardial regeneration, it was virtually useless. Vincent Ashford, in all his public promotion, had never once mentioned this limitation. He had promoted it as suitable for all heart function classifications of MI patients. To expand the indications, to expand the market, he had deliberately deleted this limitation. The original document had that limitation highlighted in red, with a handwritten annotation from Daniel beside it. This limitation is the core safety boundary of the protocol. Patient selection and clinical application must be rigorously observed. Remember this. Vincent had deleted not only the limitation, but also that "remember this." For a full half-minute, the cardiac surgeons in the hall were absolutely silent. Then a professor from Johns Hopkins stood up, unclipped his hospital ID badge, and slammed it on the table. Then a second. Then a third. Badges hitting tabletops crisp and dull, one after another like a death knell for something. They were not enraged that Vincent had stolen Daniel's work. That could be dealt with later. They were enraged because their own patients, those with end-stage heart failure, had, over the past several years, been injected with nanobots predestined to fail. Those patients had endured thoracotomies, cardiopulmonary bypass, coronary perfusion on the operating table, had suffered massive trauma and risk, and in the end received a protocol with falsified core parameters. This was not academic misconduct. One of them murmured it aloud, quietly but audibly to everyone. "This is murder." Vincent Ashford took a step backward, tripped into the crevice of the LED heart model, and toppled onto the stage. The LED heart's lights in the darkness flickered once, a backup power trigger, and then died completely. Chaos. People shouting, people running, some trying to force the emergency exits and finding them locked. Wyatt's doing, not to trap them, but to ensure that no one left before the truth finished playing. Just then, the main doors of the Maidenbauer Center swung open. Not kicked, not slammed. Pushed steadily by a single hand, the force controlled like opening the door to an ordinary exam room. A middle-aged man walked in, wearing a faded blue work jacket. Embroidered on the left chest pocket were the words, "Stillman Sharpening." He was lean, his hair close-cropped, the white at his temples stark in the moonlight reflecting off Lake Washington. Over his shoulder he carried an old canvas tool bag. In his right hand he held a medical-grade insulated organ transport cooler, still bearing a faded Biocompany liquid nitrogen sticker, the print worn but the C still legible. He walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. No one stopped him. Every gaze was locked on him. No one dared move. His pace was unhurried, each step steady as his hands pushing a blade across a stone. Vincent Ashford, scrambling up from the stage, saw that face, and his entire body collapsed again as if his spine had been yanked out. That face. He had thought about it almost every day for 11 years. Not in nostalgia. In terror. That face had appeared in the anonymous peer review comments of every paper he published, in every technical query during FDA certification, in every sleepless night. He had even started to feel that the face had become part of his own conscience. A lesion he could not excise, adhered to a critical vessel, any cut risking a fatal bleed. Now that lesion stood before him in the flesh, walking out of the moonlight over Lake Washington, out of an 11-year abyss, wearing a knife sharpener's work jacket and carrying an organ transport box. Daniel Cross, Silas Stillman, walked up to the stage and stopped. He did not look at Vincent, still sprawled on the floor. He first bent down, retrieved the remote from the fissure of the LED heart model and placed it on the lectern, as naturally as picking up a dropped hemostat in an oar. Then he set the cooler on the lectern and opened it. Inside were dozens of vials of nanobot infusion suspension stored in liquid nitrogen preservation tubes, each bearing the Ashford Heart Institute label. He took one out, twisted off the sealed cap, and drew a sample with a sterile syringe, injecting it into a portable flow cytometer he pulled from his tool bag. Its shell polished bright, the button labels worn blank. The machine hummed to life, screens jumping with cell counts and fluorescence intensity data. He let the data run, then turned the screen to face the audience. This is a sample of the Edge Return 2.0 that the Ashford Heart Institute shipped to Bellevue last week for today's live demonstration. According to this flow cytometer, the surface antibody coupling rate of this batch of nanobots is 61% of the labeled value. In other words, out of every 10 nanobots for our naked, no myocardial targeting antibody conjugated, they won't find their target in the bloodstream. They'll either be phagocytized by the liver and spleen, trigger an immune reaction, or lodge directly in the pulmonary capillaries and form microthrombi. A pulmonologist in the audience shot to his feet. Microthrombi? Are you saying this batch of nanobots can cause pulmonary embolisms? Daniel looked at him and nodded. Already have 3 cases of unexplained post-edge return pulmonary hypertension at Manhattan CV last year. Your mortality conference attributed them to poor baseline patient condition. But the root cause is here. He gestured at the cytometer data. The pulmonologist's face went white. He slowly sat back down. He had been in those 3 mortality conferences. He had said, "Consider poor baseline patient condition." He had signed the death certificates. Vincent Ashford sprawled on the stage, the corner of his mouth twitching, repeating, "You're lying, this is slander. You swapped those samples." His voice dwindled, barely a mumble, like a broken tape player looping the same ruined tape. Daniel did not answer him. He retrieved another vial from the cooler, this one not from Ashford Institute. Its label read, Silicon Valley Nanomedical, the company he had established with the backing of the Abyss Fund. He opened this vial and injected it into the cytometer. The data ran, surface antibody coupling rate 99.8%, particle size distribution standard deviation 0.3 nanometers, targeting specificity 99.9%. Every parameter exceeded Vincent's published data, and exceeded his own original protocol from 11 years ago. He shut down the cytometer and angled the screen so everyone could see the 2 sets of data side by side. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silent hall every word fell as cleanly as a scalpel on skin. A fix already exists. This is the corrected version of Edge Return 2.0, anchoring efficiency uncoupled from cardiac output limitations, targeting antibody coupling rate over 99%, nanobot particle size distribution SD under half a nanometer. The full Phase 3 clinical trial protocol has already been fast-tracked through FDA and EMA approval, launching simultaneously at 18 centers globally. All data will be made public in real time, open to global peer review. No falsification, no overwriting, no selective reporting. He placed the corrected vial on the lectern, next to Vincent's vial. The 2 vials looked almost identical, both transparent glass tubes, both pale blue liquid, indistinguishable in the dim light. But one was a lie and one was the truth. He pointed at them. The left one is what you stole. The right one is what I'm taking back. Compare them yourself. A profound silence filled the hall. Not the silence of digesting information, but the weight of something heavier, like an operating room waiting for the chief surgeon to speak, and the surgeon hasn't yet. Vincent Ashford knelt on the stage, staring at the 2 vials side by side, his lips moving soundlessly. The scar on the back of his left hand, 11 years old, glowed white in the dark. The cut from Daniel's scalpel shallow, long since healed. But suddenly his right hand began to tremble. A violent tremor. His fingers convulsing uncontrollably. Someone in the audience gasped. It was the occupational disease of those who do long hours of microsurgery, tendinitis. But when it erupts alongside such massive psychological shock, it could mean something deeper. A functional tremor, from the collapse of the central nervous system's protective inhibition. Vincent grabbed his right hand with his left, but the right kept shaking like a runaway micromotor. He stared down at his own trembling right hand, and for the first time in 11 years, his eyes showed an emotion he had never allowed: fear. Not fear of punishment, not fear of bankruptcy, but a surgeon's most primal terror. If the hand is destroyed, everything is destroyed. Daniel looked at him. At those hands he had personally guided countless times, now shaking uncontrollably before him. He reached into his tool bag and drew out a scalpel, the same one from 11 years ago. The handle engraved Daniel Cross, cardiac surgery, the broken blade reground, shorter by a third, but the edge still sharp. He held it up to the light so everyone could see. Vincent, do you remember your first solo cap? Your hands shook so badly you couldn't suture the vessel. I told you then, trembling hands don't matter. Steady your heart, and your hands will steady. Your hands are shaking now not from tendinitis. Your heart is crooked. When the heart is crooked, the hands will never be steady again. He set the scalpel on the lectern, next to the 2 vials. 3 objects side by side. 2 vials, 1 broken and reground scalpel. A silent exhibit. The title could have been 11 years. Then he turned and walked toward the doors. At the threshold he stopped without looking back. Julia. Julia Ashford's whole body jerked. The bouquet of lilies finally slid from her lap and hit the floor, petals scattering, the white fragments like small pieces of peeling skin. Daniel said, Nell's due date is next week. She's at Johns Hopkins. All her vitals are good. Don't come see her. And don't tell her you know about me. She thinks her father died in a medical accident 11 years ago. Let her keep thinking that. His tone was flat. No accusation, no sarcasm. Just a statement of fact. He pushed through the doors and disappeared into the moonlight spilling over Lake Washington. He had said Nell. Nell Cross, his daughter. When he fell 11 years ago, Nell was a freshman in college studying journalism. She spent 3 years trying to investigate the truth of her father's fall, going through every public case file, interviewing everyone who might have had contact with him, only to be finally told, accidental fall, no criminal element. She didn't believe it, but without evidence she had to accept. 4 years later she changed paths and enrolled in medical school, entering the cardiac surgery program at Johns Hopkins, starting from scratch learning anatomy, pathology, surgical procedures, her own way of understanding the life her father had led. Now she was a chief resident, working her last night shift before maternity leave. She didn't know her father was alive, didn't know that every quarter a Mr. Stillman delivered a batch of freshly sharpened surgical instruments to Hopkins and lingered at a distance to catch a glimpse of her. She didn't know that her husband, an attending cardiac surgeon at Hopkins, when submitting the ethics review application for the Edge Return clinical trial, had received anonymous reviewer feedback with suggestions so surgically precise they could only have come from his father-in-law. She knew nothing. Daniel had decided to keep her knowing nothing. Some truths are too sharp. Holding them cuts the hand. He was already a broken blade. He didn't need his daughter becoming one too. Almost at the same moment Daniel left the Maidenbauer Center, global capital markets detonated. The Cougar Mountain screen broadcast from Vincent's event had been filmed by countless tourists and spread exponentially across social media. The first post was from a landscape photographer shooting the night skyline across the lake. His caption read, "Holy shit, the mountain screen just got hacked, and it's showing a dump of some medical company's dirty laundry, scalpel murder something." He attached 9 photos. The first 8 were the documents on the screen, the 9th was a stunned selfie. The post was shared over 1 million times in 40 minutes. Ashford Medical's share price on the Nasdaq went into free fall within 120 seconds of that post. The circuit breaker was triggered 5 times in the opening minutes, setting a historic record. The real carnage was in after-hours trading, where Ashford Medical stock crumbled 92%, from $162 a share to $13. Countless investors flooded social media with rage and despair. Some posted screenshots of their entire life savings in Ashford Medical. Others said they had mortgaged their homes and were now hundreds of thousands in debt to their brokers. But for every seller there was a buyer. All the buy orders converged toward a single source. Luxembourg, the Abyss Fund. Julian Crowe sat in the windowless trading room in Luxembourg, staring at the torrent of transaction data on his screens, his face expressionless. Before him sat two items, a cup of stone-cold black coffee, and a photograph of himself and Daniel Cross 30 years ago, standing in front of their medical school, both in white coats, impossibly young, laughing without a care. After the Abyss Fund closed its positions, it issued an open letter to global investors. It consisted of a single paragraph. "We are not making money. We are settling an account for a man who was robbed of 11 years. Days later, the FDA issued an announcement. Effective immediately, all clinical use of Ashford Heart Institute's Edge Return nanobot infusion was suspended, all marketed products sealed, and a full-scale clinical data audit initiated. Simultaneously, the Department of Health and Human Services announced the formation of a special investigative task force into the origins of the Edge Return technology. The FBI's Economic Crimes Unit joined in parallel, opening a criminal investigation into Vincent Ashford on multiple counts including trade secret theft, clinical trial data falsification, and public endangerment. The language of the announcement was unprecedentedly blunt, using phrases like egregious in nature, severely consequential, and extraordinary public harm. The day Vincent Ashford was taken away, it was raining in Seattle. Not a storm, but that fine, dense, persistent drizzle that settles in and never stops, soaking the whole city in gray. He was led out of the Maidenbauer Center's back-of-house by two FBI agents, wrists cuffed, a jacket draped over his hands, head bowed as he shuffled forward. Reporters crammed the hallway, flashbulbs strobing his face into a ghostly flicker. As he ducked into the sedan, one photographer caught an image. His trouser leg rode up, exposing an ankle wrapped in an anti-embolism compression stocking. Years of standing for long surgeries had given him severe varicose veins. He couldn't stand for 30 minutes without them. The stocking was splattered with rain, plastered to his shin, a faint indentation visible where the elastic edge bit into his skin. He would probably never stand for that long again. Julia Ashford was stopped outside the venue by FBI agents, who presented her with a material witness order. She was still clutching the lilies. The flowers had wilted. Petals were falling one by one onto the rain-soaked red carpet outside the Maidenbauer Center. Before she got into the car, she looked back across Lake Washington at Cougar Mountain. The mountain screen had long since returned to normal, cycling through Experience Washington promos, the reds and greens garish in the rainy night. Seagulls circled in the rain, their cries sharp and hollow. She remembered first coming to Seattle on a college road trip with Nell, standing at the lake and thinking what a beautiful city it was. Now she just felt cold. In the second week after Vincent's arrest, the FDA released its preliminary findings on the Edge Return data falsification. The language was the sternest in recent agency memory. Preliminary verification confirms that the Ashford Heart Institute engaged in systemic, large-scale, long-term clinical trial data falsification, including the forgery of subject-informed consent forms, selective deletion of adverse event records, manipulation of primary efficacy endpoint data, and fabrication of long-term follow-up records. The Institute's de facto controller, Vincent Ashford, bears direct responsibility for the above violations. At the end of the statement, a line was appended. This investigation received the full cooperation of the technology's originator, Professor Daniel Cross, and his team. It was the first time the FDA had used the name Daniel Cross in an official statement in 11 years. His name had returned to official documents, not as the deceased, but as the technology originator. That same day, the New England Journal of Medicine formally retracted two of Vincent Ashford's Edge Return papers, with the retraction notice using the rare word academic fraud. Vincent's membership in the National Academy of Medicine was suspended. All academic titles and honors were stripped in sequence over the ensuing review. His name was scrubbed from the rosters of professional societies, as quickly as scraping a layer of paint with a razor. At the criminal trial, Vincent Ashford faced charges of attempted murder, trade secret theft, clinical data falsification, and depraved indifference public endangerment. The deadliest evidence came from his own hand, a German-made sterile rubber glove. This was the physical evidence Daniel had carried back from the abyss. As he fell, the scalpel in his hand had sliced a cut across Vincent's glove. After the fall, the cellular residue on the blade, from the dermis of Vincent's left hand, was fully preserved during forensic sampling. For 11 years, that biological sample had been stored in a liquid nitrogen tank at an independent forensic institute in Switzerland, maintained at a constant -196°C. DNA analysis showed a complete match with Vincent Ashford's profile. The cut in the glove matched the broken edge of Daniel's scalpel to a 99.9% degree of certainty. When the forensic expert displayed the two blade edge comparison photos in court, the silence was so absolute you could hear the HVAC hum. Vincent Ashford, in the defendant's seat, upon seeing this evidence, instinctively touched the back of his left hand, that shallow white scar, still not entirely faded after 11 years. He lowered his head and offered no more defense. His lawyer made a final effort, arguing the statute of limitations on the attempted murder charge, but the prosecution demonstrated that Daniel had lived under continued concealment and credible threat of harm from Vincent, constituting a legal tolling of the statute. The court accepted the argument. On multiple counts, Vincent Ashford was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Julia Ashford was sentenced to 3 years suspended with 3 years probation. The court considered her a secondary accomplice in parts of the data falsification and gave her leniency for proactive disclosure. At sentencing, she wore a gray coat, her hair pulled back low, no makeup. Her diamond caduceus brooch was confiscated as illicit property. Her name was removed from the Johns Hopkins Distinguished Alumni list. As she left the courthouse, a reporter asked if she had anything to say. She shook her head, got into a cab and was gone. Later, someone spotted her at a community clinic on the outskirts of Baltimore, wearing a plain white coat, taking an elderly woman's blood pressure. She had lost a lot of weight. At a glance you wouldn't recognize her as the woman who once sat in the front row of an international forum with a diamond-studded caduceus pinned to her lapel. Daniel Cross did not attend the trial. In his capacity as a special expert consultant to the FDA, he embedded himself in 17 hospitals across the country that had deployed the original edge return protocol, reviewing every single postoperative patient follow-up, identifying those who needed a second surgery due to nanobot anchoring failure, and arranging for them to receive the corrected edge return 2.0 therapy. Case by case, informed consent by informed consent. 17 hospitals, over 2,000 cases, spanning nearly 3 months to complete. In the catheterization lab at Johns Hopkins, Daniel stood in lead apron beside the fluoroscopy screen, personally directing the first coronary perfusion procedure of the corrected edge return 2.0. The patient was a 67-year-old man with an anterior wall MI, who had received Vincent's version of edge return 3 years earlier. Instead of improving, his cardiac function had steadily deteriorated, his left ventricular ejection fraction dropping from 35% pre-procedure to 28%. He could barely walk a few steps without gasping. Angiography revealed that the previously injected nanobots had mostly aggregated in the pulmonary microcirculation, forming extensive microthrombi, like countless tiny grains of sand clogging the vessels of his lungs. Daniel first dissolved the pulmonary microthrombi with thrombolytics, then infused the corrected nanobots through the catheter into the coronary arteries. On the live angio screen, the distribution of nanobots in the myocardium was visible in real time, from the aortic root all the way to the apex, anchoring efficiency exceeding 99%. The dense green dots on the screen were like a swarm of fireflies that had finally found their way home. The procedure lasted almost 7 hours. When it ended, Daniel removed his lead apron. The blue work shirt underneath was soaked through, plastered to his back. The titanium scaffold in his thoracic spine, under the weight of the lead apron, was screaming with pain. The apron weighed nearly 30 pounds, and combined with the bent-forward operating posture, the load on his spine was many times the norm. But he had stood at the table without moving for 7 hours, never once sitting, never taking a sip of water. The cath lab head nurse later said to a colleague, "Those hands, I've been at Hopkins for 30 years and I've never seen a second pair like them." When he does catheter work, the feed rate of the guide wire, the rotation angle, the pause rhythm, every step is as precise as a machine, but it's not machine-like. A machine doesn't have that touch. His hands know exactly where the vessel needs to go, where to stop, where to turn. That kind of feel isn't trained. It's grown into the bone. At the patient's 3-month follow-up, the echocardiogram showed left ventricular ejection fraction had recovered from 28% pre-op to 52%. The patient's daughter wrote Daniel a letter, enclosing a photo of her father standing on his balcony watering his plants. In the photo, the 67-year-old man was grinning broadly, holding a green watering can, a row of blooming bougainvillea behind him. Daniel put that letter into his steel trunk, alongside the 40-plus sharpening ledgers. The results were ultimately published in The Lancet under the title First Successful Case Report of the Corrected Edge Return 2.0 Clinical Trial. The corresponding author line read, Daniel Cross. For the first time in 11 years, that name reappeared in an international medical journal. No prefix, no titles, just the 2 words. The editors noted in their review, the corresponding author's signature format deviates from standard convention, but given the exceptional circumstances of this manuscript, the editors have elected to retain it. When Daniel received that review comment, he smiled. He wasn't very good at smiling anymore. 11 years of disuse had left the muscles unaccustomed. Sometime later, the full technical package of Edge Return 2.0 corrected version, including the nanobot surface antibody conjugation process, the targeting anchor algorithm, and the ultrasound-guided precision delivery workflow, was open-sourced. Daniel registered an account on the world's largest biomedical open-source platform under his real name, his avatar a photograph of a broken and reground scalpel, the handle lettering faintly visible. The repository description read, 11 years of rust. Just grind it off. No exclamation point, no grand sentiment, just 7 words exactly in his style of speaking. After the open-source release, over 2,000 research institutions and teaching hospitals worldwide cloned the repository. A cardiac surgeon from South Africa posted in the repository's issue tracker, "Our hospital has no cath lab, only a single beat-up echo machine. This protocol actually includes a simplified procedure for low-resource settings. You can do the entire guidance with a portable ultrasound. I used it last week in a rural clinic to treat an HIV-positive MI patient. He recovered better than any patient I've ever treated with the traditional protocol." He ended his post with an exclamation point, then apparently felt it wasn't enough and added 3 more. Daniel replied beneath it, "I wrote the simplified procedure during my sharpening breaks in Seattle. The gaps between sharpening were just enough to figure out one thing. Good technology shouldn't be picky about its patients or its equipment." He didn't sign his name, but everyone knew who he was. The reply was screenshot and circulated through virtually every cardiac surgery community on the planet. Someone captioned the screenshot, "A knife sharpener teaches the world a lesson." Months later, the Edge Return Public Interest Fund was formally launched, with an initial capitalization of $40 billion, all sourced from Daniel's profits in the Abyss funds short of Ashford Medical. The fund's board had only 3 people, Daniel Julian Crow, and the elderly Dr. Harold Pembroke. Pembroke, after his heart episode at Vincent's event, had been resuscitated. The first thing he did upon discharge was phone Daniel and curse him out for a full 20 minutes. Why hadn't he contacted him sooner? Why had he borne 11 years alone? Did he have any idea how much it had crushed his soul every time he heard Vincent's name at an academic conference over those 11 years? Daniel waited for the old man to finish yelling, then said only 2 words, "I'm sorry." Pembroke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That fund. Count me in." The fund's mission was twofold: to support patients and families harmed by medical fraud, and to back independent researchers worldwide working on open-source medical technology. The only condition attached was, those who receive help shall, when they are able, go on to help another in need. Daniel called this condition the sterile transfer clause. He said the core principle of an operating room is sterility. Goodwill should be the same, transferred without any contamination. Julian Crow, upon hearing the name of this clause, said expressionlessly, "You're probably going to spend the rest of your life naming everything with medical terminology, aren't you?" Daniel said, "Probably. And I don't intend to change." The first beneficiary was an elderly farmer from rural Appalachia. His daughter had received Vincent's Edge Return 3 years prior for dilated cardiomyopathy, and died post-operatively from a pulmonary embolism. The farmer didn't know anything about nanobots. He only knew his daughter died on the operating table, and the hospital called it a normal complication. He had signed a consent form, which was later proven to have been forged, his daughter's signature scrawled by someone else, the handwriting crooked, as if mimicking the hand of a woman who had never learned to write. Daniel personally took a 6-hour bus ride into those mountains, the spine-jarring roads making the titanium scaffold in his back ring, but he didn't make a sound. He sat by the farmer's wood stove and, mixing plain English with medical terms, explained the cause of his daughter's death and the principles of the nanobots sentence by sentence. The farmer didn't grasp most of the terminology, but he understood the last thing Daniel said. "I failed to manage my student. Your daughter's life. Put it on my account." Then he stood, bowed deeply to the farmer, placed an envelope on the hearth and turned to leave. The farmer had never in his life been bowed to by a doctor. He scrambled to his feet and tried to help Daniel up. Daniel straightened, walked out of the village. As he reached the edge of town, the farmer caught up, breathless, and thrust a bag of walnuts from his own tree into Daniel's hands, saying, "Doctor, take these for the road." The walnuts were in a red plastic bag, knotted tightly with a dead double knot. The farmer's hands were rough, dirt embedded permanently under the nails. Daniel took the walnuts, wanting to say thank you but finding his throat blocked. He remembered 11 years ago, when Vincent was questioned by a foreign expert at an academic conference and Daniel had stepped in to shield him from every attack. Afterward, Vincent had clapped his shoulder and said, "Don't worry, sir. I'll never let you down in this life." Back then, he thought he had trained the finest student. Now he knew. The finest student won't disappoint you, but he also won't give you walnuts. The ones who give you walnuts are the ones you've wronged. Later, that bag of walnuts was brought back to Seattle and placed on the shelf of the sharpening stall. Every customer who came to have a knife sharpened would ask what it was. He said, "Walnuts." Someone asked, "Can we eat them?" He said, "No. They're for remembering. The shell is hard, the nut inside. You have to crack it to eat." Some things are the same. The walnut stayed there from the first year to the third, their shells slowly darkening, but not a single one was lost. Years passed and Daniel's hair turned completely white. Not salt and pepper, but a pure absolute white that glinted in the sun. He no longer took the operating table himself, dedicating his energy to training the next generation of cardiac surgeons. His students spread across cardiac centers in 47 countries, some at New York Presbyterian, some at the Royal Brompton in London, some at a rural clinic in Johannesburg. Every winter solstice, he would receive 47 emails, each in the same format. A photo of the student in surgical scrubs with a single line, "Professor, did XXX cases this year, all successful?" Daniel replied to everyone, always with the same line, "Hand steady, heart straight." Every winter solstice, he would also return to Pike Place Market, standing for a while in front of the old stall, now converted into the Stillman Sharpening Museum. The museum had been proposed by the city itself. Daniel had refused at first until Maggie, the market manager who had leased him the stall years ago, called him and said, "You don't have to build it, but that stall of yours is getting trampled. Last month 3 tourists got into a fight trying to take a photo sitting on your wooden stool." Only then did Daniel agree. The museum was small but thoughtfully done, faithfully reproducing every detail of his old stall. The wall of sharpening stones, the 3 bench grinders, the ultrasonic bath, the wooden stool stained gray by stone slurry, all originals. At the entrance hung the original hand-lettered price sign, protected under glass. The words "No scalpels" had been photographed and shared by countless visitors, becoming something of an internet meme. But very few people noticed the tiny line in the corner of the sign, now enlarged and displayed separately by the framers. A dull blade can be sharpened. A dull heart cannot. Visitors usually fell silent when they reached this spot. Those taking photos would stop, just standing there looking at the line. The museum staff said that, on average, at least 5 people a day stood in front of those words and wept, and they never asked why. On that winter solstice, the museum was packed with visitors. Daniel mingled among them, wearing a plain blue work jacket and reading glasses, unrecognized. Over the years he had learned the trick of blending into a crowd. Don't walk with your back too straight. Don't stare straight ahead. Don't reflexively correct strangers' medical terminology. He was so successful at it that he could walk through his own museum, see the entire exhibit, and no one would spot him. He stopped before the glass case holding the price sign, looked at it for a moment, then turned and walked out, into the steam and noise of Pike Place Market. Fishmongers shouting, flower stalls blazing with color, the air thick with the smells of fresh bread, roasting nuts, and the salty tang of the sound, strong enough to temporarily overlay any memory. He found the exact spot where his stall had once stood. It was now a stall selling handmade silver jewelry. A young woman was bent over a torch, soldering the seam of a silver bracelet. She glanced up at Daniel, asked if he was buying. He said no, and she returned to her work. He stood there, closed his eyes, and listened for a long time to the sound of sharpening. Not an actual sound, there was no one sharpening. It was the sound in his head. That sound had followed him for over 30 years. From the ore to the terrace, from the terrace to the abyss, from the abyss to the sharpening stall, from the sharpening stall to this very moment. He had once believed it was a chain. Later he understood it was a pulse. He opened his eyes and pulled from his pocket that scalpel, broken and reground. The engraving on the handle had worn almost smooth. Daniel Cross was now only shallow indentations, just barely perceptible to the pad of his thumb. He held the blade up to the thin Seattle winter sun and turned it. The edge caught the light, reflecting brighter than it had 11 years ago. He slipped it back into his pocket, turned and walked out of Pike Place Market. Behind him, buried in the market's din, a woman selling clam chowder was shouting into her phone. "Come home and eat, I made your favorite." The voice was loud, carrying that particular Pacific Northwest warmth, cutting through the whole market. Daniel's step didn't falter. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. It was the relief of finally being able to stop forcing one. All that silence and the sound of sharpening he had learned in the abyss had, at last, become the sound of hope and heartbeats for others. And that was enough.